Tyson, welcome to Austin Next.
Thank you. Good to talk to you, Jason.
It's been fun. I think we've run into each other at quite a number of events, and I'm glad we finally had a chance to sit down for this.
Yeah, I'm glad that we could finally make this happen.
So, one of the things, if people have listened to the podcast or seen any of my writings, know that one of the things I despise the most is all of the Silicon Hills, Silicon Beach, various Silicon XYZ, knockoff monikers. However, Austin actually has a little bit of claim to that moniker, given our kind of semiconductor past. And, you did run a little tiny company called, Silicon Labs. So can you give me a little bit of history on kind of the past and present and where you think we are today in semiconductors in Austin? I know, a tiny little question.
Right. Semiconductors are just one part of tech, and I think Austin is more of a general tech city than just semiconductors. But that is where a lot of this started. I think you have to really put things in perspective, and certainly Silicon Valley has the critical mass. I mean, you have companies like Intel and Nvidia and others that came out of there over many years. The early days of Austin, where we had Motorola and their semiconductor group here. AMD very early had a presence in Austin, and then so the Motorola stuff became Freescale and then became NXP, and they've got thousands and thousands of people now. AMD has really their headquarters in Austin. You've got a huge contingent of folks at Apple. You've got companies like Silicon Labs, which was founded here in 1996. Cirrus Logic, who really evolved. They were a California company that bought an Austin company and then ended up becoming an Austin-based company. So that was Crystal Semiconductor from back in the mid '80s, really early '80s. Started as one of the early fabless semiconductor companies, and that became Cirrus Logic. That was actually my first job. I came here from California. I did 4 years on the East Coast and 4 years on the West Coast, and came here out of college. I thought I was headed to Silicon Valley, but I ended up in Silicon Hills. And back then it was actually, what's incredible is Austin has doubled in that time frame. It's been one of the, if not the fastest growing metro area in the country. And what then was an outpost has become more of kind of a second center for tech in the country. And more and more folks, not just in the semiconductor world. And it's, you got to divide semiconductors into the design side, building products, and then the fabs. And so we've got really four major fabs here. You've got Freescale, you've got the stuff at what was Cypress. I think that just got sold to another group, but that was actually the old AMD fab.
So how does manufacturing obviously play into it? I mean, not to go too much into like geopolitics, but I feel like that the manufacturing and kind of the reshoring of the manufacturing of semiconductors in the U.S. We just heard, TMC is putting, I don't remember the exact number, but a huge amount of dollars into the U.S. and a lot of that is going in Arizona. Some of the stuff going on with Intel recently, where they were trying to build up their fabs. I know that was, I think, led to the pushing out of their CEO. And just as we're recording this today, they just announced a new CEO.
Lip Tan is a good friend. I served on a couple boards with him.
Oh, okay. So that it's a very small world. Yes.
Yeah. So you've got designing and selling chips, and then you've got the manufacturing of chips. And the big one in Austin is Samsung. They've got a big fab out off of 290 East, and then you've got the big factory up in Taylor, which is $40-50 billion worth of capital. So when I was 25 years at Silicon Labs. I was part of the founding team there. I wasn't a founder, but worked on some of the first products, and so we were what was technically called a fabless company. We didn't own our own manufacturing. We used TSMC. So every chip that I did a chip during college that was in 3-micron technology. That was my first chip. And then I did one in 2-micron in college as well. But and today, kind of the most advanced products are in 3 nanometer. So 3 microns is 3,000 nanometers. So over the course of a 30 plus year career. That's a factor of 1,000 in a linear dimension, and it's the area, so it's actually a factor of 1,000,000. So one transistor in the chip that I did when I first started is now 1,000,000 transistors in that same physical area, which is that is Moore's law, doubling every 2 years, and that's just crazy, right? You're just thinking about the scale of that, and that's driven computing, it's driven the internet, it's driven mobile devices, IoT, social media, all the
Now
all the
AI.
technology that we know today is really driven by semiconductors. It's interesting because I used to, I go back 5 or 6 years and I would say, oh, I'm in the semiconductor industry. It's so cool. It's changing the world. And people would like gloss over and change the topic. And then we had the trade war, kind of with China during the first Trump administration. And then, we hit the pandemic and there were all the supply shortage. You couldn't buy a car, you couldn't buy a refrigerator. And then everybody was blaming chips. It was like, oh, chips go into everything.
Yeah.
And then we had, there was a book that came out a couple years ago called The Chip War by this guy, Chris Miller. It was the first book really written about people and the history and the significance to geopolitics and economics around semiconductors. I would highly recommend that to folks. It was the #1 selling geopolitical economics book on Amazon for like a year, and really talked about vis-a-vis China and even the history with Russia and with Japan and the development of all the semiconductor manufacturing in Taiwan. And then I was on the when I was 10 years as CEO at Silicon Labs, so I went through a number of different products, and we transformed the company into an IoT company. So Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, Zigbee, Z-Wave. We were basically at the edge, all the things that are wirelessly connected. It became the leading platform for that. And during that 10 years, I was on the Semiconductor Industry Association board, which was the main lobbying group for the semiconductor industry into Congress. And I worked on the CHIPS Act and, talking to people and about these subsidies that you were talking about. Mm-hmm. And so that was a $53 billion, initiative to really rehome a lot of the manufacturing. So over that, 30-year time frame, the U.S. back in 1990 had about 30% of the global semiconductor manufacturing. And as companies, for instance, AMD sold their fabs and became a product company. You have growing large fabless companies like Qualcomm and NVIDIA that didn't own their manufacturing. And then you also have to break the semiconductor industry into logic, which is kind of, CPUs, GPUs, all that, and then memory. And so you had Samsung doing a lot of the memory and Micron being a large US company. So those are two different types of factories. And typically the memory companies both have their products and their manufacturing together. Intel is what they call an IDM, an integrated device manufacturer. And they sell their products, but they also own their manufacturing. AMD split those apart. I would argue that 20 years ago, Intel probably should have done the same. And NVIDIA has always been a fabless company. I've always worked in the fabless industry, that we didn't own our own factories. We would use TSMC, and they kept building more and more factories in Taiwan. So today, 50% of the semiconductor manufacturing capacity is in Taiwan, 100 miles off of China. And the most
advanced... funny, that's actually, given the perception, that's actually a lower number than I was expecting.
Well, that's the total capacity. And, China's building up a lot. That number may be a little bit smaller now. And okay. China's mostly building like older technology. So right. we don't let them import the latest equipment, but they're building some of the older technology. TSMC has the whole gamut. 90% of the most advanced technology is based in Taiwan, pretty much all TSMC. They're one of the top 10 most valuable companies in the world.
Right.
And, NVIDIA being one of the top companies now with the whole AI wave. I'm sure we'll get to that.
AI is slightly a thing, yes.
Intel is, 1/30th the market cap of NVIDIA, and has fallen behind on the CPUs and on the data center and really missed the whole AI wave, and also fallen behind on all the manufacturing. But all of those older factories in Taiwan, like once you get done with the most advanced node, those older nodes are useful, and they made that available to the whole industry. So the whole industry uses, all the way from the most advanced technology to some of the legacy nodes, depending on the type of product that you're building. So, for instance, up in Dallas, TI is the largest analog company. And they have a mix. They use some outside foundries and they have some of their own. They're building a $30 billion complex up in Sherman and got some of the CHIPS Act funding. Samsung here. And then you mentioned TSMC. They're getting a lot of pressure to build factories in the U.S. They announced about $60 billion in the initial tranche, and they were getting some CHIPS Act funding. And then more recently, they announced another $100 billion. There's some real question as to whether all that CHIPS Act funding is actually going to be funded or not. And I think ultimately it will. It's been appropriated by Congress, and all these companies, started building factories assuming that money was going to be available. But even with all of those subsidies and all the announcements, the U.S. might go from what is about 13% of global capacity today to maybe 20 to 25% of the global capacity. And I like to say that, in the new Cold War with China, if you want to call it that, but certainly the economic competition with China, semiconductors are at the heart of that, in the island of Taiwan with that concentration. And it's a little bit like the nuclear weapons in the first Cold War. If we lose access to those fabs, it'll make that shortage that happened during the pandemic look like nothing. I mean, you won't be able to build anything. I mean, you think about a car with probably 500 or 1,000 chips inside of it. If one of them you can't get, you're stuck and you're not building the car,
right. We could have the most
refrigerator or whatever. And
you could have the most magical, the most advanced technology in the world, and if you can't actually build it or ship it, then what's the point?
Yeah, and it's hard to just say, "Oh, we're going to build factories." You probably have 100,000 products running in those factories in Taiwan, and a lot of those were done a long time ago. So it's very hard to just take them and, oh, I'm going to build a new factory here. And the other problem is, if you think about risk in the global supply chain, if you're going to build redundancy, if you're going to mitigate risk, you're going to build overcapacity, and that overcapacity in the world means that pricing goes down and you end up with oversupply. And so there's a real balance between, okay, do I want to minimize my risk, but then I'm building redundant capacity. I'm not going to shut down the old factory that I've already spent billions of dollars building. And so
there's always been the claim that infrastructure boom and bust, while is negative for the companies that go through that, but ends up being positive for society because you end up having that oversupply of infrastructure becomes very cheap that you end up being able to build off of.
Right. I mean, there's Jevons paradox that as you lower the cost, people use more. There's only so much elasticity in how many chips need to get. There's growing and growing demand. There's certainly on the AI side, tons of build out of these data centers and huge capital investments going on. But that risk mitigation, I mean, really, it's like the mutually assured destruction is the island of Taiwan, and specifically the chips. They've called the semiconductor industry in Taiwan the Silicon Shield. Mm-hmm. And now we're applying leverage and saying, no, you have to build this here. We have to if something happens with if there's a trade embargo or something like that, or even worse, kinetic battles, these factories get taken out. We're in a real mess. But it's also China's in a real mess because a lot of those products get shipped into China, assembled and shipped out somewhere else, or consumed within China. So they would have hundreds of millions of people out of work. We would have trade embargoes. They wouldn't be able to get oil and fertilizer and all sorts of things that they need to keep their economy going, which, in history is kind of the reason why people stand up and demand change in terms of, regimes or
what do you
whatever.
think about the speed of, when I look at some of these factories that are being built, and whether it be, and correct me if I have any of my data wrong, the Intel Columbus factories or some of these that seem to be moving slower. And I remember when you were speaking at Arena Hall a few months ago, and I asked this question, and I did say that I was going to bring it up again. And when you compare that to, and it's not quite an apples to apples, I understand this, versus like the Colossus data center that XAI put up in Memphis in record speed, that even Jensen was like, I've never seen anything like this. And look, we can all say, Elon's a one of one, and I understand that, but isn't some of the things that we look at this and just say, are there first principles that are being challenged in any of these building? Because at the same time, the gigafactory here was built faster than expected. And when I look up at what's going on in Taylor and the Samsung plant, it's delayed and slower and these kinds of things. And so the question is, could some of these things be going faster if we if some of these companies or or people were willing to challenge to some of the basic assumptions that or take some of these risks that we hadn't been taking before?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is a mix. We've got constraints on labor, and we've got constraints on equipment availability and that sort of, what are the lead times? The in the chipboard book they talk about the ASML machines, the lithography machines, and these are the most complicated machines ever built by man, most precise mirrors ever built. There's like 500,000 parts in one of these things. They cost upwards of $1 billion a piece, and that's used to draw the lines on a semiconductor chip.
It's one of the most valuable companies that almost nobody's ever heard of. Yeah.
Right. So ASML is based in the Netherlands, but they have a substantial presence in the U.S. They've done Cymer, the laser that is used for that ultraviolet light, deep ultraviolet, extreme ultraviolet light is designed by a San Diego company, but or that they had acquired. These are the most complicated factories ever built, and it's incredibly precise, and you have to get everything. You have to build a building, but then a clean room, and you put the things in there. You have to have a recipe and a process, and then you have to get a product in there. And just to go from, if I start a wafer today, the fastest you can get it through the 60 steps required to actually, produce the product is about 2 to 3 months. And that's, once you got to go through that a couple times to make sure that, all the knobs are tuned to the right, especially if you're at the cutting edge and you have to figure out a lot of stuff in the middle. So TSMC got their factory in Arizona running in about 2 years, and that's extremely fast. And I'm sure that more labor availability and a little less regulation and all that, but they ran fast, but they were replicating a factory that was in Taiwan. They didn't do the cutting edge. They did kind of N-1. So one generation back, that can go very quick. It's very different than building a data center. I mean, think about all the stuff that had to show up in that 14 days to get that data center in Memphis going. And there are racks of equipment, and in those, there's been years and years of building all, designing the chips and getting the chips and procuring the chips and putting them in those boxes and putting those in racks and getting all the cables and everything ready to be able to get that. And then you basically, you back up a few trucks, you wheel the stuff inside, you plug it in, and you turn it on. And that can be done in 14 days. Doing a semiconductor factory is much more complicated, and there's no way that say, okay, let's let Elon build a semiconductor factory. He's not going to do it in 14 days. So it is. But that being said, there's various reasons. I mean, Intel's got a lot of problems. They're behind on their manufacturing. They're pushing their own version of the cutting edge, and they've also got financial issues. They've got their products are not competitive anymore. They've tried to open up their manufacturing to other companies and not been successful. And Lip Bhutan has a monumental task ahead of him to make that work. So the delays in Ohio are more financial and economic than they are physics and engineering. And
Sure.
construction. Yeah.
No, yeah, there's a lot of, as you said, figuring out what the path forward for Intel and a lot of these companies are. And I think even Samsung, I was just reading the other day that they're asking some questions on what the right path forward and how that affects Taylor is an open question. But again, that to your point, it's a business question, not a physics question.
And I think that if you just look at business more generally, there's the tariffs and stuff like that are going on. Both are incentives to move things, but we don't have necessarily a stable policy on that yet, and it's not even on the subsidies we don't have there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think that a lot of times businesses, in the face of uncertainty, the best thing to do is to wait. And I think that applies to the consumer as well. And so if you have certainty and you know what's going to happen and you can plan and you know that, I mean, because you build a semiconductor factory and you've got to run that for 5, 10, 20 years. And that you've got to have the economic environment, you've got to have the demand. You don't want to create an oversupply. So there's a lot of factors that balance these things out that are beyond just, oh, let's build it. It's like you actually have to know you could use it. You have demand for it. And that,
So where do you drive? So okay, that's an interesting. So where do you drive the line between having as a leader, as between certainty and boldness? Because by the time that any decision maker has perfect certainty, you're behind. But then, to your point, there's also, and it probably gets back to your risk tolerance, right? If you're if you're at a completely, uncertain world, and you have no, we'll call it zero information, then you're fighting blind. So where do you think about, as you, whether you're, when you were running Silicon Labs or today at Circuit, thinking about, making a decision, how much information do you need to make any sort of decision to move forward?
Well, I mean, certainly you have to listen to your customers. You got to think through if you look just broadly at the business climate, there's been a trend certainly since the mid 2010s that we need to diversify outside of the supply chains in China. That you can't. So in other words, you got to assess the risk to make sure that you've got a backup plan. So for instance, at Silicon Labs, we looked at, okay, now we've got TSMC, but now, okay, you start working with TSMC and putting pressure on them and saying, hey, we need supply outside. And then you start looking at other suppliers and we need supply outside. So you diversify. And I think that's, whether you're talking about Dell, you're talking about Apple, you're talking about Google or others, they're looking throughout their supply chain and what are the key risk factors. More broadly, we have, over the last 50 years, leveraged globalization to leverage external labor and put things where they are cheapest, really not considering the geopolitical risks of, supply chains getting cut off and tariffs and all this sort of stuff. We had free trade and we're able to leverage, the world to optimize for cost. And there were a lot of, there was a national security problem that we kind of, gave up a lot of our manufacturing base. We lost a lot of our manufacturing jobs, but businesses became far more profitable, far more productive, and the U.S. benefited a lot from that. So you get pluses and minuses, but we have essentially optimized the global economy around the free trade and free flow of goods and people and all this sort of stuff. And now all of a sudden, starting maybe 10 years ago, that started to close down, and we went to more onshoring and deglobalization and moving things out of certain regions, factoring in risk. So I think businesses across the board have to assess those things. But a lot of times, like the most draconian thing of like, hey, I got to move that all that back here, puts you in such a in other words, it's going to be more expensive. So if you're going to deal with building redundancy and dealing with risk has a cost. And the question is, how much can a business tolerate before they become unprofitable and uncompetitive? And so there's a natural balance there that there is this trend. And those things take time. Moving products out of Taiwan and building a new fab and it takes decade to do that. You could argue that, it's kind of human nature that a lot of times you don't deal with the problem until it's a real problem, and then it's usually too late, right? So, in other words, if you have to go on a war footing, you could probably build that fab pretty quick, and you're going to figure out, all right, I'm going to give up this old stuff and just focus on the new stuff, and there's going to be, a natural shuffling process that happens in that. But, I don't know if you can ever be fully prepared for a major disruption, black swan events that only, it's like you deal with after the fact. You can prepare for them, but you're not going to fully prepare for them until it happens.
Yeah, it's just one of the things. Like, I mean, you always we don't, I think a lot of times, whether it be large companies or small companies, I wish we'd spend more time doing wargaming, risk gaming, just at least preparing yourselves mentally for those kinds of ideas. Like, not even, you will never have, I mean, the idea of a black swan is that you can't be prepared for it, because the idea that you're going to create the right scenario, that that's the exact one's going to come up. But at least spending enough time thinking about those types of things that you're like, oh, it kind of rhymes with something I've thought about before, that you can at least go and dust off that thinking and be able to be more adaptable in that sense. And understanding that you don't have to spend all of your time doing it. But, when, my background has been like, I was in strategic planning, and it was surprising to me at some of the large corporates I was at, when asking these types of questions. With, bringing up, I won't say the company, whatever, but I was like, I was like, we are going to get kicked out of China at some point. And I was like, well, no, 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 no. And at this point, that company has been kicked out of China. I was like, if we had spent some time years ago actually uh, thinking about it or planning, I think they might have had at least a better thought of what to do about it when this is happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in these scenario planning situations, there's a certain set of things that you can control, and then there's a certain set of things that happen outside of your control, right? So you've got, in other words, your suppliers, your competitors, what other people are going to do. In other words, you can say, all right, my plan is to go use this. Well, if everybody else's plan is to do that, there's not enough of this to use. And so in some ways you can't predict everything until it happens, and specifically how it happens, and whatever, you don't have full visibility. You don't have full visibility into necessarily your whole supply chain. You can try to, go and talk to everybody and try to figure that out and try to get the answers. And,
Oh,
reality is somewhere in the middle.
to your point, the plans that come out of that are, it's what is Mike Tyson, a plan is as good until you're punched in the face, right? The plan in itself is not, out of those things, are not necessarily useful as much as I think is to train your brain to have like seen it before enough to be like, okay, it's not a shock to the system. It's not a, you're right, because everybody goes this way. It's like, oh, well, if everybody went that way, and I kind of thought about this before, so yeah, that is, maybe that
I mean,
is the
the
right,
real
go this
question is,
way.
like, how much pain are you willing to take in
Yes.
preparation for getting punched in the face?
Yes. What do you do after you get punched in the face? That's the next move. Because if everybody's staggered back, you're like, oh, I kind of felt, you're right. I felt this before. Let me go again.
It's not just that you're getting punched in the face; that everybody gets punched in the face. And then what
Yeah.
happens? Maybe not the greatest analogy, but it's an interesting world. And I think that if I'm a glass half full guy, so I'm always looking at the future and thinking ahead. I left Silicon Labs a couple years ago, and we had sold off our legacy business, and our IoT business had reached $1 billion. Had a good transition there, and after 25 years at that company and having a great time, it was like, I actually, it's kind of the first time I had taken a couple. I'd never really taken off more than a weekend between jobs. I don't vacation well. You can ask my wife as to whether it's like, I'm working on vacation, and I don't golf. I like people, and I love building stuff and thinking about what's the right thing to build and what's going to be next in the market. And got a little time to, first time I had two kids in high school, and thinking about the world and what's coming along. And I've also lived through a lot of the, if you take globalization as one of the big boosters of productivity, technology's been the other one, right? So computing and the internet and cloud and social and mobile and IoT and all these different technologies have totally changed the world. And here's this new AI boom that's coming along. I studied, so I went to Johns Hopkins undergrad. I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I was born an engineer, and I ended up, after my junior year in high school, I sent out 50 resumes because it's like, I want to do something in electronics. I always wanted to do electronics, and I had taught myself, circuit design, and built all sorts of, taken apart a lot of stuff, but then started building stuff, and self-taught on a lot of that. This is back when you had to go to the library and get books, and And so I was like, I got to get out of Oklahoma if I'm ever gonna do anything. So went to the East Coast, wanted to learn how to learn that other culture, which was a whole lot of fun. But Hopkins had a real strong medical thing, so I ended up studying a lot of the early neural networks, kind of the predecessor to what we call AI and machine learning now. And really interesting math. Did a bunch of projects. Went to UCLA after that, and it actually did my master's thesis on a neural net accelerator. Did some papers. It was and then I decided in 1992 that there was no practical application for neural networks and AI. And that was probably the right call back then. You could build these like
In
really
92, yeah, probably the right call.
They weren't that useful. And fast forward 30 years, and yeah, this stuff is now you can do it at scale, and we're approaching human intelligence, and so this is the next big wave. You look at that's driving the semiconductor industry, right? Memory, all the GPUs and all of that stuff is
NVIDIA's making a couple of bucks driving this stuff,
NVIDIA has done with Jen. I'm super happy for him. He started NVIDIA when I was starting out in the industry. I followed him for years and years and years, and he's he's always 10 years ahead. He saw this wave coming. He set up the APIs and all the software, and has stayed at the cutting edge of Moore's law and figured out this new paradigm of computing, parallelism, and doing all of those algorithms to be able to solve these. Neural nets is a different type of math. CPU is not very amenable to that.
30 years ago, you were doing neural nets, and now AI is clearly a thing, and you kind of jumped up in the stack from semiconductors to AI with Circuit. So tell me about both what Circuit's doing and that transition of moving up in the stack.
Yeah, so I've always enjoyed kind of that, coming up with an idea and building a team and building a product and taking. I've done like 7, from taking idea out to hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue.
Only 7? I mean, come on, you're slacking.
Only 7. We did mass storage, hard disk drives, networking at Broadcom. We reinvented the computer modem, all the old dial-up stuff at Silicon Labs, reinvented the way cell phones connect to the network, and integrated a bunch of stuff on the front ends of that, like 100 components into a chip. Did the same thing for radios and TVs, sold several billion of each of those, and then building the IoT business. And so, as I look out at what I wanted to do, it's like I want to do a startup. I think that, as opposed to, I'm not going to, I got at least one more run in me. You learn so much over your career, and you want to take and apply that and do something good with it. I also, in the semiconductor world, semiconductor companies aren't a brand. I mean, maybe NVIDIA is kind of a brand, or maybe at one point Intel was a brand, but you're a component in somebody else's. And I wanted to get closer to the user, and also move. If you think about the stack of value in, we're in Texas, so energy is powering all these data centers, the semiconductors, and so, NVIDIA, TSMC, Dell, and other component suppliers are supplying into the data centers. Then we're building all the data centers, like XAI and all the hyperscalers, Google and Meta, Amazon, and others. And then all the software runs in those. And so the big driver right now is a lot of the AI companies like OpenAI and Anthropic and others are getting a lot of data and training up these massive models. And then there's people using those models, right? So, in other words, I'm using AI to do something, and I'm applying that into the economy. And that kind of sits up at the top. And I view that as where a lot of in other words, if I'm going to take this new capability with the language models and make people more productive or make people more connected, that's the application of AI. So going from the bottom of the stack, kind of midway down, up to more of the user facing and the application layer, and really the network layer is what we're really, really working on, of how to apply this into the economy. And so this is going to be a big trend. It's going to dramatically change the way we work. It's going to dramatically improve productivity and grow GDP. It's going to impact how we all perceive information, or how we interact with the world. Essentially we have our own robot, our own agent in the cloud that we can make useful to do things for us. And that's a huge opportunity. So it's like, okay, here's this new capability. And then how do you map that into an idea for a new business? How do you enter into the market? How big is the market going to be? Who are you going to compete with? And then what is your product going to be? And then you got to build a team, and you got to build a product, and you got to take it out and make a business success out of that. So, replicating that, that earlier thing that I've done in my career, but now in a new world, there's a lot of new technology to learn, a different skill set, and it's a different time. And so I've been thinking about this for a couple of years now. And, as I left Silicon Labs and was thinking about all the various options, it's like, there's a place for a startup. The other thing is, like in hardware, things take a long time. Like to do a chip, I'd have to raise probably $100 million to get my first product out. And it would take me maybe 3 years. And that industry is consolidated a lot and matured. And so you're going to be going after one of the big guys or picking up a crumb. And maybe you improve data center efficiency by 1%, or maybe you build a little bit better accelerator. You're not going to change the world. AI's got the chance to change the world and change a lot of things. And that's going to create a lot of value and impact people's lives directly. And so maybe it's that mission-driven aspect that really inspired me. And I think that the other, just as you're thinking about what to do, and as you're how to approach, okay, I want to do a startup. It's how that technology maps to, this new technology if you start with a clean sheet of paper. Great thing about a startup is that you have zero revenue and everything is growth. And you also can think things through kind of from like first principles, right? It's like, okay, all the legacy applications that are out there were built in the pre-AI days, and that was one way of working. So now that we have this new capability and you have a clean sheet of paper, how would you structure the workflow? How would you structure the way people interact with the data and information and with each other, given that you have this new capability? And it can do things in a much less structured way. We spend a lot of our time structuring data. It's like, it's this system or this system. There's a lot of fragmentation, a lot of silos. The internal data in a company is different from the you don't integrate the external data as much. You have all your personal stuff, which is like separate. You've got all this paid stuff. You've got your Salesforce and your HubSpot and different. If you look at the average person, they have. I think it was 5 years ago. You had to use 13 different systems to get your work done every week, and we're up to 19, if not 20 now. And we keep bolting on these new things, but our workflow has stayed the same. There's an interesting analogy in robotics. It's like everybody's like, well, why are we building humanoid robots that look like people? And it's like, because the jobs that they're going to do will replace a person. In other words, that was the whole way our economy is structured and our workflows. It's like, it's actually people that are doing stuff. And so you pull a person out, okay, now the robot can do that, but it's still that same framework. If you start with a clean sheet of paper, you wouldn't build the robot to look like a person. You would just totally rework exactly, how everything's done. And I think from the analogy on the software side is that we can rethink how things are done. So the general, the origin story of this came. I'm on the Federal Reserve Bank board. I've always enjoyed finance and economics, and business and stuff. And I got invited by Rob Kaplan to join that board. Joined in January of 2020, when everything was smooth sailing. And then this thing called the pandemic came along, and we started printing a lot of money. We drove a lot of inflation, and had to react to all that crisis. And I was the only tech person and the only Austin person on that board. So that 5 years has been super interesting. But we've got like 6 board meetings a year, and so I felt compelled to write up a report every time on the tech industry and the semiconductor industry in Austin. So I'd compile all these different data from all these different sources. There's 20 websites and these research analyst reports that I get in my email, and news stories and all sorts of stuff. And during the between meetings, I would jam them into a folder, and then I would give myself one day to like create my report. And it was painful. I'd have to read through all this. I tried to get my CFO to help me with it, and it's like he's got to read all this stuff. I've got 5 years of reports and all this context, and started trying to use AI to do that, and it was pretty shallow and wasn't really doing a great job. So the context of pulling data and information from all these sources around a topic. So in this case, the topic was my Federal Reserve report. And it was trying to talk about everything that's going on and how that relates to monetary policy and how that relates to Texas and what are the major events, and sorting through that. That was, it's like how, and then once I'm done with that, I put that aside, and then I have to kind of restart it the next quarter. And it's really hard to automate all this stuff. I need some way to do this. So that was where this topic of a circuit came along, and where it's like you organize your information around topics. You get information from all these different sources. You pull them together, and then you can like activate it. And what I really wanted was I wanted that report to be kind of like a dashboard, just like a living document, so that as I changed all the input sources or as something new came out, that it would just automatically update, and then I just go in there and I push publish and send it off. And so that was one inspiration. The other one is I look at a lot of the networks that are out there. I spent a lot of time in public media and journalism. I've been pretty civically engaged in Austin. I've been here 32 years now. Was on the PBS board, was on the NPR, the KUT board. So KUTX was my idea to have a second station so we could have an Austin music station. So that was on the board when we bought the 98.9, and then a big supporter of the Texas Tribune, and a lot of that challenge that we have out there in journalism. You've watched the decline of the Austin American Statesman, and I was on the board at the Austin Monitor, and that's the local and really everything's had to move to the nonprofit model because the for-profit model is broken because social media has taken all the targeted ads, all the ad revenue moved to Google and to Meta. So Google's revenue is mostly ads, and it's $330 billion last year, and Meta was $130 billion last year, and all that's gotten sucked out of traditional media. And then you look at the structure of networks, and it's all it's like you're kind of monetizing people to put them in their echo chambers so that you can serve ads to them, but we end up forgetting everything that's in the middle. So this concept of topics was how do we pull everything to the middle, and instead of just a post, you have like actual knowledge. And then there's the power of networks. I've known Bob Metcalfe for a long time. So Metcalfe's law is like the value of a network is proportional to the square of the number of users. It really is like n log n. It's not quite a square law, but it's a powerful exponential that as you connect more people together, you get all this value. But then I look at the networks and I'm like, well, it's not really that valuable. We all spend a lot of time on our networks, but I can't really use it for productive things. I can connect with people, and like think about LinkedIn. LinkedIn's been the same for 15 years. And
yes.
It's not, and I've got a whole lot of friends on my LinkedIn network, but it's like that's not integrated with your workflow. And I've got my contacts. I've got it's like stuff is just all over the place. We've got like too much information.
They've also not built any products on it. I used to run market intelligence when I was at Beck and Dickinson, and I literally was like, I will pay LinkedIn. I have money. I will pay you for certain data that I can correlate, that I know that you have, but I could never get it. I could never get it. And the funniest thing was like years later when I was actually writing the Austin Bio and Health Report to the first one, and found out that the exact type of data I was looking for, they were giving to recruiters, but then they wouldn't sell it to market intelligence. It was like, what, like, what are we doing here?
So it's like a couple of things, like having a network that's useful
Yeah.
and that is open and that can integrate. So most of the networks have kind of, it's like they try to close off their, it's like, I'm going to own everything. So it's
Yeah.
like, if you think about Facebook, you got friends over there, you got people on Instagram, you got people on TikTok, all those are closed. You could also think about networks as messaging like Slack or, Telegram or Signal or whatever else. Those also create networks, but most of our enterprise apps are not networks, and they're siloed within the organization. So a lot of the relational activities that happen within companies are really complex and take a lot of time. And so we identified this concept of circuits and building a network in the context of relational activities. We think about it as intercompany communications and collaboration and sharing. If you think about, like, when you go from one company to another, like within your company, you have systems, right? You got too many systems, right?
Right.
You've got a lot of silos, and but you've got a way of working. You're on Teams and Slack, or you got Office, and you've got Drives, and you've got your ERP and HR systems and CRM systems and all that stuff. It doesn't typically, and people spend a lot of their time just shuffling among all those things. And there's a lot of companies coming in, like things like Glean and others, that are working within the enterprise to help solve that problem. But what's really broken is when you go from one company to another company. So the other company is on their own systems, and then really think about it like to the in person. And in person's on whatever. So everything defaults to the least common denominator, which is email, maybe a website and a search box, text, voice, and so there's this need for a new medium of communication and sharing and collaboration between organizations. So Cort Lorenzini was the founder of DocuSign. He just joined us as an advisor. And if you think about, like, before DocuSign, you used to have a notary and a fax machine to send a contract to somebody, or you had to mail it to somebody. Right? Here's how you got to have my wet signature on a notarized document, and I have to send that to you to buy a house, or we got to all show up in the same spot. All of a sudden, you can, they proved out, I think they started in real estate transactions that, okay, now we can do this digitally. And so now I don't know how many DocuSigns you get in a week, but it's a lot.
Yeah.
It's pretty useful. And that solved one particular pain point between organizations. But we are finding, as we're out engaging with the market and talking to customers, and going after, in the end, the other part of a startup's, everything is growth, and you're starting with a clean sheet of paper. The other thing is you only have so much time and so much money, and you've got to drive revenue as fast as you can. So it's like you can't boil the ocean. You got to focus. You got to thread a needle to get your first 10 million of revenue. And in the AI space, the valuations are crazy. After my first 10 million of revenue, we will have a company worth 500 million. I mean, that is the world that we're living in, and how the venture capitalists and how the markets are valuing. Now that, you get to 10 million, you can't get stuck. You got to be on your way to 100
Right.
to a billion. But there is a massive opportunity sitting out there. And so we're focusing on building out, the other challenge you have is, if you're trying to build a network, you start out and you don't have a network. So it's a chicken.
It's called star problem.
Called star problem. So we're starting out in this, company to company, or think about it as your partners, your vendors, your customers, your members. In other words, I'm an organization. I've got my stuff, but I've got all these external people that I have to communicate with. And it's really when you go from one company to many companies. So, for instance, in the semiconductor space, Silicon Labs had 2,000 employees, about 200 salespeople, and we had 25,000 customers. We served about 1,000 of those customers directly, and we had 25 distribution and representative partners who would then sell to the other 24,000 customers. And each of our product teams had to put together all the product information and share that out with all of these distribution partners. And then Arrow Electronics was the largest global distributor for electronic components. They're $30 billion, based up in Denver. and they've got 400 companies on their product, their line card to be able to sell. And there's all this information, all this product, hundreds of pages each document with thousands of documents of stuff that the people out in the field have to grab and figure out what's best, what's new, what's the latest. Tons of questions and stuff, and all those other every company's on a different system, and it's in a drive, it's some electronic data feed, or there's just a lot of manual work in there. And so that's an example of a distribution network that can greatly benefit from AI, but is not an AI enabled today. It's like we're competing with like a cloud drive and an email box.
Yeah, I mean, I see like a lot of it's been interesting to see just me as an individual, and I use. It's funny, like the way you described the reports that you were making, and I like one example. I put out like the a weekly Austin Bio and Health roundup just because like it was interesting, and I would put notes in a Evernote, and then I was writing stuff out, and then I was putting it in one long chat chain in ChatGPT to try to keep it in that. Now it's a project with custom instructions that putting in to try to get that faster because it was kind of learning and in that because it was essentially the same thing roughly every week and just kind of putting in the new news so that I didn't have to like it wasn't highly deep reading as much as just like here's the headlines from like the things that are happening. But a lot
of that's manual. Yeah, we're using a lot of Notion these days. That's like the latest iteration of a productivity app and note taking. But it's like there's a lot of manual work.
It is still, yeah. I'm still finding versus getting the feeds coming in. Yeah,
things get old. The cool thing about AI is that it allows us to work in a more unstructured way. So let's just say, okay, I have this container called a circuit, and you pull information. So every note I take, it's around this, as long as it's related to this topic, it's like that whole process, like in the Fed, if I had a folder that I would drop everything in, now I had to like go and do something with it. I had to read it all, and then I had another folder. It's like, now I can just put this into this AI enabled container, and AI can read, and it can write, and it can think and deduce and do all this stuff. So it can take all the data in that, and it creates a knowledge graph. And so then you're doing graph RAG, so retrieval augmented generation. So in other words, I'm feeding my proprietary data into the model. The model was trained on all the open data, and that's only like 10% of the world. You've got all your personal stuff, your notes, your enterprise data. None of that's trained into the model. So you got to make that available to the model. And we're doing that in the form of these topics and circuits. And as you put things in there in an unstructured way, it learns everything and makes all the connections so that it can actually intelligently answer questions and do stuff with it. And so that's a part of changing the way we work. So instead of spending all of our time organizing this, we can focus on making sure we've got the right data and then what we're trying to get out of it. So it short circuits the learning process and allows us to, sorry for the pun, and it allows us to abstract ourselves from the details. So we've got one customer who is, they've got 12 product lines and about 10,000 documents in various forms, and many of them are hundreds of pages long. And there's no one person in that organization that can have read all of that stuff, but the machine can. And then you can ask a question, and then you can find out exactly the page. It gets you the answer. Here's the latest thing. And so that's huge for your personal productivity. But what we've learned is that as you move up from the person to the work group, the collaboration gets much, much, much more efficient. And then across a company, and then you go between companies, and then you go out onto a network. And as you grow, in other words, those are basically larger and larger networks. And as you get into larger networks, this concept becomes ever more powerful. You can grab these and nest them together. You can grab parts of them and work with them. And so that is fundamentally the capability that changes the way we work, and that changes the way we collaborate, changes the way we share and activate information. That I think is fundamental to how we work. and fundamental to the application of AI into the economy is really leveraging the network effects and leveraging this new capability in a way to make the network truly useful and open at the same time.
So I have a question, and I'm going out in the roadmap in my head, and feel free to say like,
That's what I
yeah,
do pretty much 24
yeah.
hours a day now. So you're
And
welcome. Welcome to
so,
the team.
so I'm thinking about like the network effect, but just taking out the network and pulling it just to me in this situation. And I give you an example of something I did. Oh God, it's almost 2 years ago. Um, on the podcast, but I'd used, which is I created and we're going to use it. The create's going to do a lot of work in this term. Uh, a innovation chatbot using ChatGPT in this case, where I kind of prompted it and said, okay, you're a hive mind of all of these great innovation thinkers, from like Clayton Christensen to Da Vinci to Robert Solow, like all, to builders. And it was like 20 people in there. And, then used a bunch of like very kludgy at the time, probably today be a lot easier. Interviewed it was Andy Bot was the name. It was the Austin Innovation Dynamic Innovation Bot, or Austin Next Innovation Dynamic Innovation Bot. And it was an interview on the podcast. But I've also then was using the bot actually as a assistant. Now, it was not properly trained on the data. It was just that I assumed all of the work and research of these people were in there. I could see using something like Circuit to be like, actually, please pull in all of their actual academic work and research, pull in the kind of like all of the work that I've done on these podcasts and the particular research that I'm thinking about, my frameworks, the way I'm thinking, adding in voice work so that you could have those kind of conversations and actually build this innovation assistant to help me think in the types of things we talk about with deep research and that Grok and OpenAI are doing. I mean, if I go out, I'd say years, but the speed that AI is working, this could be next week. Could Circuit do this?
Yeah, there's AI is going to make this too much information problem worse, and it's going to create a lot more information. And so I think a good example. So this is going to be useful for you personally. So let's just say that there's a circuit for Jason that's got all of your online presence. It's got all of your you should have all your. We can take podcasts, transcribe them, learn them, understand who was speaking and what was talked about, and now that knowledge is inside that circuit. And you can do that personally. You could have somebody help you with that, but then you can publish that out publicly. You might even want to charge for it, or not, right? But and you might want to, or let's say you were doing a podcast on nutrition, and you wanted to get Peter Attia's book inside there. You wanted to get all these articles and all the things. In other words, if you had interviewed me, if I had a circuit that I shared with you with all the stuff that I've done, now that's my knowledge that's public that I want to share that you can include with this podcast. And now there's a greater context. And so that's where it's like, it's got to be personal and personally productive. You've got to be able to collaborate with people, but then it's really that sharing out on the network in this new medium. It's not just, it's like the people that are listening, they had to listen to this, and there's a certain amount that you could keep. There's only so many podcasts that I can listen to in a week. And it's not very many. And there's a lot of them that I would like to. And so being able to abstract ourselves from the details to be able to like grab the insights, figure out what's like most useful, and then drill in if you want to, include sources from all these different places that I think is really kind of the foundation of learning and innovation. That's at the center of how all of this stuff is going to come together. But you got to create the network, because I think that this, in absence of a network, is not nearly as powerful or as useful. And so you have a lot of listeners, and there's a lot of people that pay attention to this, but they have to listen to these right now. And now if all of that information can get pulled into one place, that becomes more useful. And you can grow your audience, you can grow your impact, and people can take that and combine it with different things and create new things. And it's a really exciting time. It's things are moving very fast. Every week there's a new innovation. Things keep getting cheaper and keep getting better. And we talked about Moore's law, about doubling every 2 years and going from 1 to 1,000,000. AI is moving and has moved over the last decade or more 4 times as fast. So it's doubling in capacity, doubling in capability, or having in cost every 6 months on average over the last decade. And it doesn't take too far to run that out to think through what's really possible here. And I mean, we are living in an unprecedented time, and things are moving so quick, and so many, jobs are going to be, the jobs of the future are different than the jobs of the past. And, what should our kids study? What are we going to be doing 5 years from now? And it's exciting. I mean, if I look at that decision to leave Silicon Labs and go do something else, it's like, if you're not in the middle of that and trying to figuring out how it's going to be applied and how it's going to change the world, and try to do something good with it, because AI is going to be used for a lot of bad stuff. There's going to be disinformation and polarization and societal upheaval and politics and all this stuff. But if you're not in the middle of that, you're just going to be sitting off at the sidelines watching it happen. And we want to try to provide something that's good for people, but it's also going to disrupt a lot of things. One topic I think is interesting before we finish up here is we've just as we're thinking about setting up the company and the structure, we allocated 20% of our shares. So like 20% of the founders and every employees get an additional grant that they pledged into the Circuit Foundation. And so in other words, when you're pledging it, you still own it. But then as we build equity value, you donate that into the foundation, you get the tax break. So half the money in that foundation comes from the tax breaks that you get. And then that's viewed as a very good thing for the employees coming in, so for recruiting, for the culture of the company. So aligning the mission of the foundation with the mission of the company. So it's the foundation will be dedicated to AI literacy, helping to teach people about what AI means and how it's used, workforce training, so folks that need the skills for the jobs of the future, and the civic applications of AI, call it journalism or nonprofits. And we want that to be spread across the country and ultimately across the world. And we want to build the largest foundation in the country.
Well, that's fantastic.
And, you got to have big goals, right? And which is actually a shockingly small number. The largest foundation in the country is Gates Foundation. It's about $70 billion. And a typical foundation gives away 2 to 3% of their corpus per year. So that's a few $1 billion a year. You can do a lot of good stuff with that. But you compare that to the size of the economy. And there's a lot of foundations, but the economy in the U.S. is, call it $30 trillion. Global economies, $100 trillion. So, if you think that philanthropy can solve every problem and that you don't need government or you don't need taxes or you basically have to have an economic engine behind the things that we need to do, whether it's education, whether it's, keeping people informed or whatever else. And so as we're building, our goal is to build a big, profitable, impactful company, and at the same time build social capital on the side that can go and do a good thing. Our goal is to get public, and that when we get public, that over 10% of our equity will be in a foundation. The Circuit Foundation was separate, 501c3 separate. It's a little bit different from the way Sam Altman, guys at OpenAI, set it up. They realized later it's like, oh, we're going to make a lot lot, and then let's take it back. I think that this could
that's
be
a whole complicated thing they got there.
I don't think we've given away anything. I think when you grow up in the tech industry, that you have a win-win. The world is not a zero-sum game. We're creating things out of nothing. And to the extent that our company is 10% more successful, we've had several investors make this pledge, which we haven't been requiring. And customers see this as a very good thing. And so if that reduces risk of our success and increases our growth, if we're 10% more successful over time, it's a win-win for the community and for us at the same time. And so we don't feel like we're giving up anything. And so that's kind of cool. If you contrast this to, this was actually motivated by, like, at Silicon Labs, I wanted to set up a foundation, but it's really hard once you get going, because then you got to give up something to when you at the beginning, there's nothing. Right? So
it's all
again,
upside at that point.
That blank sheet of paper. It's like you just want to think it really carefully through as when you're at that 0 point. Yeah. But so a good public company will give away 1% of profit to the community every year. That's the 1% pledge considered.
Mm-hmm.
We had made that pledge, and that was on a good year, pretty hard to achieve. Let's say $1 billion company, $250 million of profit, $2.5 million a year, and if you count it in kind, we kind of get there. And on a bad year, that's the first thing you cut. And so having a foundation, it can be more consistent. It also doesn't reduce your profit. But if you think about that $1 billion company, if Silicon Labs had been set up the way we're talking today, $1 billion company, call it a $10 billion market cap, certainly in this space, $1 billion foundation, 2-3%, $25 million a year. It's 10 times the impact.
Wow.
And at the same time, it's not reducing our profit. We're focused on building value. We're building value over here on the side. I think that's fantastic, and we're super excited to have that structure in the beginning and to try to be an example for others as they're starting out on the journey.
Well, as you think about the foundation and the impact to the community, I think it's a great place to end with the same question I ask everybody. So, Tyson, what's next, Austin?
Well, I'd like to say that Austin's been successful despite itself. We said if we don't build it, they won't come, and well, they all came. I said that Austin has grown, it's doubled, and yeah, we've lost a lot of things in the process, and it's tough. We've got affordability issues, we've got transportation issues, we've got all sorts of challenges as a community, but this is a wonderful community. Austin is still weird. South by Southwest is this week. People come here. We've got more and more tech. We've got more and more restaurants. We've got, a lot of thought leaders. And, I back to my glasses half full. I think that the future is extremely bright. I think what's next for Austin is we've got to start thinking like a bigger city. We've got to think about the future and plan, and not just be more tactically or reactionary in things, but really think big picture. Think when we're not just 2.5 million people, but we're 5 million people. And you add San Antonio, it's 10 million people. Think about Central Texas being bigger than the Dallas-Fort Worth area today in 2025. And what does that look like? And you're the first thing you think is, I-35 is going to be a mess, right? So it's like, and what are those long-term investments? How do we connect our communities together? How do we make things more affordable? How do we plan for what's possible? It's like we talked about Silicon Hills, and maybe that's small, but it's like, tech is spreading everywhere. So we got to build great companies here. We've got to have great talent. We've got to make this a place that is affordable, and where our quality of life doesn't diminish but goes up. And that's possible. I've traveled around the world. I've seen how this works in a lot of different places. And sometimes I do feel like we have, both as a state and as a city, our head in the sand. And, it's like you just hope that the leaders and people in Austin really all put their heads together and think about what a wonderful place this is. It's a great business climate. It's a wonderful place to live. We have so many people. We have so many resources. But it's what we do with those. And, it's like you can kill the goose that laid the golden egg, or you can you can build the future. And so I'm real optimistic about what's next. But all the people that are listening and all the people in Austin need to you know, pull up their boots and go make it happen. And you know, I think that's both making this, you know, an economic success, but also thinking about how to bring everybody else along on that journey. And you know, what makes Austin isn't just one thing. It's not just tech. It's not just the university. It's not just the, you know, the state government that's here. And you know, it's the culture and the people, and not forget where we came from, but make sure that we you know, we build the future that's better than it is today. So
Definitely. Let's do it. Tyson, thanks for joining the show.
real pleasure. Thanks for having me on, and look forward to next time.
So what's next, Austin? We're glad you've joined us on this journey. Please subscribe at your favorite podcast catcher, leave us a review, and let your colleagues know about us. This will help us grow the podcast and continue bringing you unique interviews and insights. Thanks again for listening, and see you soon.